Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. Once upon a time, your television didn't televise much, and most of what it did broadcast was a vast wasteland. But on a Monday morning in 1969, suddenly everything changed.
Sunny day, sweeping the clouds away.
Sesame Street, an ambitious attempt by a crew of creative artists to prepare disadvantaged tots for school. Sunny Days is the story of a children's television experiment that became a cultural revolution. Author David Kamp says it changed America. Next. I am delighted to welcome David Kamp, best-selling author and longtime contributor to Vanity Fair. David, your book arrives at a very polarized moment, as polarized, I would imagine, as the 1960s were. But then, somehow this country could unite to work on improving the lives of preschool children.
I did not anticipate how much the beginning of my book would rhyme with current events when I was writing it. And I'd give anything for it not to rhyme. But all that said, Joan Ganz Cooney, who was one of the co-founders of Sesame Street, said that people in the late 60s were watching TV. They were watching one horrible event after another, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and RFK, anti-war protests, the Vietnam War itself. She said the TV just showed you one terrible thing after another, and people watching TV said to the TV, so do something. And then she said, and finally the TV did something. And what she means by that is that both she and Fred Rogers with Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood saw that to really remedy these systemic wrongs, you were going to have to start with the children. You're going to have to reconceive what children's television can be.
But in addition to these people, Joan Ganz Cooney and Lloyd Morrison, whom we'll talk about, you had government. The government was very happy to be involved and contribute and push for this initiative.
Right, that's one way that doesn't rhyme with today, meaning we were in the middle, we meaning the United States of America, were in the middle of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, when he unleashed all sorts of progressive initiatives that basically expanded the government safety net. The Head Start program, which was meant specifically to give kids in poor neighborhoods, whether urban or rural, a leg up on when they entered kindergarten. They would sort of be on a level playing field with kids from middle class and affluent white suburbs. So Sesame Street was kind of almost a television complement to Head Start, and it had half of its initial budget of $8 million a year actually came from the federal government via the Department of Education.
This was aimed at preschool kids because, there was no preschool in those days.
Yeah, it's astonishing because we forget because we're so acclimated to nursery school being a thing, but in 1970, only 20% of all children were in nursery school, and more than half of America's school districts didn't even have kindergarten. So the burden of raising kids, and also you have far fewer women in the workforce, the burden basically fell to the mothers and grandmothers of America to just care for kids. And that was a heavy burden, and especially in poorer families, you didn't have a leg up. You needed some kind of boost, federally assisted boost, to sort of start school not already being behind.
And the principal actors, if you will, in this drama were Joan Ganz Cooney and Lloyd Morrison. Give us just a really brief, thumbnail bio of Joan and Lloyd.
Okay, Joan comes from a well-to-do Arizona family. She decides in the 50s, as a young woman college graduate, to get into TV, not for the reasons people usually get into TV, to be famous or to pursue some artistic passion, but because she thinks it's a medium for doing good. She thinks, how can I use TV? Anti-poverty was her issue. how can I use TV to spread the word and disseminate ideas for fighting poverty? Lloyd Morrison, meanwhile, is a psychologist who works with the Carnegie Corporation, and he's trying to initiate programs, mostly at small scale, for how do we help early childhood? How can we apply new developments in developmental psychology? But the problem is the scale of what Lloyd Morrison was doing were these like trial programs of 50, 100 kids. And so Joan Ganz Cooney and Lloyd Morrison become friends in the 1960s. And in 1966, at a dinner party, Joan Ganz Cooney's not even talking about children. She's just talking about how can we use TV to help poor people? And Lloyd Morrison saying, how can we use TV to help kids in early childhood? Then they combine those two ideas, and that's sort of the genesis of Sesame Street.
You suggested in the book that it was sort of an epiphany, a moment for Lloyd Morrison about television's ability to teach. When on a Sunday morning, he wakes up early before television is on the air. In those days, people sound so quaint today. Television came on at 7 in the morning and went off at midnight or 1 a.m. and there were only a handful of channels. But at 6:30 in the morning on a Sunday morning, what does Lloyd Morrison find?
Lloyd is awakened by this beep sound, and he follows that sound into his living room where his preschool daughter is watching the test pattern on the screen because she's waiting for cartoons or something to come on. So Lloyd Morrison, both as a parent and as a developmental pediatric psychologist, says, if my daughter has this tractor beam lock on the television or vice versa with nothing on, just think of what television could do with something good on.
They decide, the two of them, that this could work. And money comes from the government, and money comes from Carnegie and Ford Foundation. And 4 years of research and experimentation on which Joan Ganz Cooney writes a proposal. Talk a little bit about all of the preparation.
Well, there were so many components. The Children's Television Workshop, which became the producing entity that made Sesame Street and later the Electric Company, had not just teachers as advisors, but they had developmental pediatric psychologists, and they had researchers to see how effective the TV, the experiments in short form TV were in reaching kids. They actually had a guy named Ed Palmer, a chief of research, who set up something called a distractor, which was a screen perpendicular to the one the kids were watching to see if their attention would be pulled away. And so you did that level of research. On top of that, you have this entertainment division of seasoned entertainers, people who a lot of the writers were Captain Kangaroo veterans who knew how to write for children and to keep them engaged. And John Stone, who was one of the early producers, effectively the showrunner of the original Sesame Street, said Joan Ganz Cooney's greatest epiphany was to not try to turn teachers into entertainers, but to try to turn entertainers into teachers, because that turned out to be a far more effective way to reach kids.
And you remember that first program, or are they some of those early ones?
I can't remember that precise day, but my mom, who is a research scientist for Johnson & Johnson, reads the New York Times, and she sees an article like, public television to launch experimental preschool program. And so I'm one of those first kids watching. I was watching that day. What I do remember, Tony, is that it was almost as if it spoke to my generation in a way that even my older siblings, it didn't reach. It just was so right, because we were TV literate at age 3, 4, 5, because we came up in a way that kids born even 5 or 6 years earlier hadn't been. And so it's this wonderful combination of Muppets and music that's kind of music of the time. It's soulful, it's funky, and we're so responsive to it because it's reaching us generationally in a way that 1950s kids wouldn't have gotten.
Today's kids are so scaringly media savvy.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, it seemed like there was a general lack of understanding that kids could be that media savvy. And yet they were. Kids locked onto this like it became a phenomenon, a
Right.
cultural phenomenon.
Kids were media savvy already, but not in a good way, meaning kids were watching too many cartoons. They were watching too many crass shows. That there was one in 68 or 69 called Hot Wheels, which was basically a half-hour long ad for Mattel's Hot Wheels. It was so controversial that the FCC had to pressure Mattel and ABC to pull that show. So kids were already media literate, but how can you use this media literacy of this generation, meaning my generation, for good? And that's precisely what Joan, Ganz, Cooney, and Lloyd Morrison were doing, saying, what if we flip this on its ear and use the pacing of 1969 TV? The pacing was borrowed from Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, which for your younger viewers was this late 60s comedy sketch show that had this rat-a-tat-tat, really fast pacing.
Have you ever been picked up by the fuzz?
No, but I'll bet it hurts.
Talk about finding good, knowledgeable entertainers, people who knew how to use television to teach rather than teachers and trying to turn them into it. Perhaps the greatest find of all was Jim Henson.
Yes. In the mid-60s, Jim Henson's already a wealthy man. He's also a father of four, and he's interested in the educational components of Sesame Street, and he says, I'm in. And what's more, I'm actually going to put aside all my lucrative advertising work to participate in Sesame Street. And one of the last commercials he made was for a snack called Munchos. And there was a monster in that commercial called the Munchos Monster, who was not blue, and he didn't like cookies. He liked salty, savory snacks. But the Munchos Monster was repurposed as the Cookie Monster. And that's a good example of how Jim Henson used his savvy in advertising and TV literacy and applied it really effectively to educational television for small children.
So Sesame Street hits the air in November of '69. It immediately, as I said before, cultural phenomenon. I read somewhere that as an example, there was a New Yorker cartoon at that time showing a young girl, a 3-4-year-old in the park feeding pigeons. Mom is there, but a cop comes along and says, why isn't that child at home watching Sesame Street?
Okay, yes, I have heard of that. Yes, it became a widespread phenomenon. And because it was so well written and well produced, it engaged adults as well, which I think was really important in getting parents and children to watch it together. And it became this thing. Even the Wall Street Journal had a front page story about how Sesame Street was being watched by people like George Plimpton, the public intellectual who was editing the Paris Review. People were watching it even if they didn't have kids around, because that's how good it was just from a pure television standpoint.
Ran into early criticism, some of it quite valid. There were women were underrepresented, Latinos weren't on the show. There was a whole issue with the representation of blacks. And interestingly, most of the criticism was coming from the left, not the right.
Well, Joan, Ganz, Cooney from the outset called Sesame Street an experiment. In fact, there was no idea that it would even last beyond season 1. And even in the first few seasons, no one anticipated that this thing would be around 50 years later. So because it was an experiment, Tony, it had the ability to make adjustments on the fly, and they were open to admitting failure or coming up short. And a good example is that even though the show very consciously was trying to reach a Black audience early on, the Hispanic audience at home was saying, where are we? Why aren't we being represented? And a coalition of Hispanic activists demanded a meeting with Joan, Ganz, Cooney, and it was contentious, it was really argumentative, but she listened. And I just want to tell you, Tony, about when I interviewed Sonia Manzano, who was hired at age 21 to play Maria in the 3rd season of Sesame Street and then stayed on the show for 40 years. I said to her, it's amazing to me that Joan, Ganz, Cooney took that meeting, got yelled at, but still listened and acted upon the suggestions of this coalition of Hispanic activists. And Sonia Manzano, we were at a diner on the Upper West Side, and she pounded her hand on the Formica table and said, that's the most important thing in your book. Joan Ganz Cooney was a white person who listened. So many people of that era and even this era don't want to hear other voices.
Talk a little bit, David, about the black controversy, which got pretty heated and drawn out, involving or springing perhaps from the black character on the show complaining to Joan Ganz Cooney that we're more Westchester than Watts.
Yes.
Out of which comes the creation of a purple named
Roosevelt Franklin.
Roosevelt Franklin, yeah.
Yes. So Roosevelt Franklin is the creation of Matt Robinson, who is the African-American actor who played Gordon on the show. Matt Robinson wasn't just the guy who played Gordon, though. He was also a producer and writer on the show. And he felt that there needed to be a character, a Muppet character, who is palpably and manifestly Black, because the default behavioral pattern of a Muppet was a white male, because virtually all of the puppeteers were white men. And so Matt Robinson developed this character, Roosevelt Franklin, who was, for lack of a better term, very street, meaning he spoke in a kind of jivey pattern. He had these dance moves and everything, and he'd do these rhyming alphabet and counting songs with his mom. And I can tell you, as a preschooler, he was my favorite character. So he wasn't just speaking to Black kids watching at home, he was speaking to white kids. And I think he was doing a lot to familiarize kids like me with Black culture. And Questlove of The Roots, who is, you know, the drummer, and he leads Jimmy Fallon's band on NBC, he did the foreword to my book. And he said, as a small kid in Philadelphia watching at home, I felt seen for the first time from that character, Roosevelt Franklin. However, at the Children's Television Workshop, there was a contingent of executives. These are all Black people at the Children's Television Workshop who said, we're trying to get away from that image. They had a more upper middle class, aspirational, bourgeois perception of how Black youth should be represented on Sesame Street. Whereas Matt Robinson was saying, no, we should show it not just quote unquote aspirationally, but as a mirror. And I think Matt Robinson was right, in my personal opinion. But Joan Ganz Cooney, again, heard all sides. And in this case, I think she chose the wrong side.
The upshot being Roosevelt Franklin, Muppet, was gone from the show after what, 3 seasons?
Well, he hung on for a couple of more seasons, even after Matt Robinson left. Other puppeteers voiced him. But I think the cancellation of Roosevelt Franklin was one of the frustrations that led to Matt Robinson departing the show after just a couple of seasons.
Joan Ganz Cooney had talked about, at some point in the run up to this, had talked about closing a gap between advantaged and disadvantaged preschoolers, and it didn't close any gaps. But
no, I mean, it's the term they used back then was the achievement gap. We hope to close the achievement gap between, you know, middle class kids in the suburbs and impoverished kids, disadvantaged kids in the inner cities and in rural areas. And as Lloyd Morrison said, it's kind of like Social Security. Any widely distributed social good is going to, you know, rich people will get it and poor people, they all get Social Security, but it's not going to close the gap between them. And the Children's Television Workshop people kind of regret that they used that as the measure, because that wasn't the right measure. What you measure is, did Sesame Street do a better job preparing kids for school? And yes, it did. Unequivocally, their surveys, their research prove that in inner city schools, Black kids came to school better prepared than they had been prior to the existence of Sesame Street. The other thing, Tony, that I want to make a point about, and it was a secondary goal of Sesame Street at the time, but I think it's one of the most lasting legacies of Sesame Street, is that it taught America about diversity, about multiculturalism. When Sesame Street went on the air in 1969, it was truly the Blackest show on television, because Flip Wilson's variety show wasn't on yet, Soul Train was not on yet, and you had this multiracial cast 5 days a week. And for 1969, that was extraordinary and unprecedented. And I think that went a long way towards not just helping Black kids watching at home and Latino kids watching at home feel seen, but also having white kids watching at home say, oh, that's what humanity looks like.
Wonder if we could have another program like that and call it up instantly, because we sure need one now.
We sure do. And I think, when lockdown began and we had this kind of muddled, abrupt response to how do we educate our kids with home learning and video conferencing like the kind you and I are doing now, it was all improvised. And I feel so bad for these teachers who had to improvise and muddle through how do we educate small children this way. I think what's going to happen if this is a new semi-normal is that we're going to have that level of preparation, that 3.5 years of work that went into the first episode of Sesame Street. We can't just improvise a solution that's going to air tomorrow. We're going to have to really think long-term about this. And I think we're going to have more federal involvement too, the way we did in the late 60s.
The title of the book, Sunny Days, refers, as suggested throughout this interview, not just to Sesame Street, but the other programs of what you call the children's liberation movement. I mean, Zoom, for instance, came along out of Boston talking about integration of kids a couple of years before the Boston busing crisis. Fred Rogers was already on the air and doing a very different kind of program, but taking kids seriously.
Yeah, Fred Rogers, everyone thinks that he is just this saint who walked on the earth simply by being himself. And to some degree, that's true. But what people don't realize is that he, like Sesame Street, was steeped in developmental psychology. So he wasn't just winging it as this very nice man who happened to have a television show. He worked every day with a developmental pediatric psychologist named Dr. Margaret McFarland. And so that show was really carefully thought out too. Like the reason that Fred Rogers, when he walks in singing "It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood," walks from screen left to screen right, was to prepare young kids for how their eyes will track when they read, at least in the English language. You read left to right. And when the trolley goes to the neighborhood of make-believe, that was to address the fact that kids need transitions when they're going from the nursery school room to the activity room or the lunch room. Transitions are hard for small kids. So that's what that trolley was for. So there was a lot of forethought, and no one was just winging it. And that goes back to video learning. You can't just wing it. There has to be preparation.
How disappointed are you, David, in Sesame Street now? I mean, here's a program that started as a public good, and now it appears on a channel you have to pay for.
Well, it's not entirely true, Tony. The current setup is that there's an exclusive window for HBO customers, and then it's eventually released to public television. I'm loath to sort of disparage latter-day Sesame Street because they're still doing really good work. They're addressing, they've added a Muppet who is autistic. They've addressed issues of what you do when you have a parent who has addiction issues or a parent who is incarcerated. They're still addressing kids on the margins of society and the problems they face. But if you ask me, do I like latter-day Sesame Street as much as I liked early 70s Sesame Street? Of course I don't. The older show is much better. It was livelier. It was more willing to take risks, and it was more willing to fail. The other factor, Tony, is that the viewing age has gone down because TV literacy has started at a younger age. So the current Sesame Street is made more for 2- and 3-year-olds, whereas when I was little, it was aimed more at 4-, 5-, and 6-year-olds. So it's inevitably, I don't want to say dumbed down, but it's going for developmentally an earlier phase.
We started, David, talking about how polarized the time this is, how polarized the time the 60s were, but we were a very different country in the 60s, it seems. What sunny days can you envision for this time?
Well, I'll tell you what, I conceived of the idea for this book in 2015, which was a long time ago. But even then, I sensed something, a certain brokenness to American society. And that's part of why I did this deep dive into this era. And I think that the title Sunny Days is not just a nostalgic walk back to sunny day, sweeping the clouds away, which is the themes of the Sesame Street the theme song of Sesame Street. It's a hint to society that we have to think about the most marginalized among us. And if we lift up the least fortunate among us, we lift up everyone. And I think we do need to return. We know after this pandemic that we're gonna have to kind of rebuild society. There's so much unemployment, so many broken things that these current crises have revealed. And I think we're gonna have to talk about having a bigger social safety net again, more federal involvement. And I think sunny days are entirely possible. And I think that the book and the events described within it offer a bit of a roadmap for how it was done and how it can be done again.
Well, in addition to the pandemic, from which we have to rebuild, there is the racial,
Yes.
horrific racial issue of police killing Black people.
Well, I'm actually hopeful that the much maligned millennials and Generation Z, one thing I recognize in those younger generations is less careerism and more idealism than my generation, I'm afraid to say, or the baby boomer generation, which kind of surrendered their ideals to some degree. I really see in Generation Z, which is what my kids are, a desire to return to the sunny days mentality, the Joan, Ganz, Cooney mentality of going into television or starting something up, not for financial incentive, but because it's the right thing to do.
I hope you're right, David Kamp. The book is Sunny Days, the Children's Television Revolution That Changed America. It's been a delight, David. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, Tony. Thank you.